Like, we can't live in stress, in survival mode, and try and think clearly. It doesn't work that way. And so I think just being open to letting different theories or different models of how we can function, which we may not have understood before, when we can open ourselves up to that, maybe you can get to that, maybe I'll try this, or maybe I'll just do this experiment and see if it works.
In every single interaction, there comes a moment when we wonder, do you see me? Do you hear me? Welcome to the Heart to Heart podcast. I'm your host, Gayathri, and I'm the founder of Campfire Kinship, an organization building inclusive cultures through storytelling. This season is about exploring something that is core to being human, and that is our need to belong. So imagine gathering around a campfire with stories reaching your heart. I am partnering with CJSW 90.9 and recording in Mohkinstsis or Calgary, a sacred place where the Bow and Elbow Rivers meet, and home to Blackfoot Confederacy, Tsuut'ina, Stoney Nakoda Nations, Métis Nation, and all residents of Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta.
Dr. Tarah Lynch, I welcome you to the Heart to Heart podcast. I'm super excited for our conversation. You and I were chatting a little bit before we hit record on this topic of curiosity, and you had shared with me that you have over 20 years of expertise in research, education, leadership. You are a scientist, and as a scientist, you've mastered the art of analyzing complex systems, identifying patterns, and finding innovative solutions. And you now have very artfully and skillfully taken those skills and applying that to creating and building inclusive, high-performing teams at Diversity Scientific, which is, I believe, the name of your company as well. And your approach to team dynamics is with that same curiosity that you bring to scientific research. So I'm really excited for our conversation. I'm excited to hear your story and also hear your perspective on how you see curiosity enabling the benefits of diversity as a driver for innovation. With that, I would love to invite you to share what brings you into this space and into this work. Hi. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the invitation. So yeah, I guess a bit about myself. I'm very fortunate to have two loving parents and younger siblings that I actually really like spending time with. My dad is of Indian descent from Malaysia, and my mom is Irish-Scottish from Canada, from Medicine Hat. I'm the oldest in my family and the oldest grandchild on my dad's side. So I've always grown up with a lot of pressure to be the, in quotation marks, good or obedient child, the responsible, polite, and fit into that definition of that very narrow view of what successful means. Growing up in Canada, I often get asked, "What are you?" Because I'm ambiguously brown and not quite white. I grew up in Canada in a house where we straddled both worlds. We ate curry every second day and alternating between roast beef and mashed potatoes or pasta. I feel very blessed to have experienced very different worlds, but it also means I also never really truly felt like I fit in. And culturally, the expectations of kids are very different. The order that you're born, the gender, your color of your skin, religion, just to name a few things. And between Malaysia and Canada, things are very different. And I've always had a hard time understanding why there were such limited categories that seem to matter. For a lot of my life, I've been trying to fit into the expectations of others. I think I'm not alone in that. A lot of people have the same experience that you feel like you're always trying to prove yourself or fit into these expectations that you feel other people's put on you. And that's been a big theme, I think, my whole life. I really got into science and math because those made sense to me. They were objective, expectations were clear, and it's always been a comfort to me to have those clear expectations and those things set out. Growing up, I thought my job choices were doctor, lawyer, nurse, hairdresser, firefighter. So I chose doctor. It sounded like the best option. I really wanted to help people. And I've always been a really social person. So I thought dealing with people every day was great. I guess I really just had that plan going in. I didn't know there were other options out there. As you move through high school and into your early 20s, all these other possibilities pop up in your life. In grade 12, I joined the Army Reserves. there was a program at our school to join at 17 and do basic training every weekend for 6 months. A friend of mine told me her older sister did that. And I was like, wow, I wonder what that's all about. And you go to the recruiting office downtown and they're like, sell it as this adventure and all these things you get to learn. And I was like, oh my gosh, and this is how I can pay for medical school. So that was my plan. And then you move into your early 20s, going into university, and you're completely wide-eyed as this like baby adult going into the world where you're overwhelmed and having to navigate all this stuff on your own. And I found university in those years were just huge for seeing all the different possibilities that were out there. And you have access to professors and TAs and people in different programs. And I just felt like my world exploded. And I found research and discovered that it wasn't a lonely place for introverted people that don't like to talk to people. Research is very social, it's very collaborative and exciting, and there's lots of travel involved. And so I fell in love with it and haven't looked back. And so I think the work that I'm in now in this space, I'm currently working in the public health lab, and I get to work on a lot of diverse things and meet with a bunch of different people in different areas. And yeah, so the work through Diversity Scientific is just my passion project and bringing that into more of a human space instead of the infectious diseases and the computer stuff that I work with on a day-to-day.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that, Tara. I just want to say, even when you first started with sharing your own personal identity, and the question that you would get asked is, what are you? The feeling of imagining like alienation to even hear that word, what? Like, it must be really difficult just having to navigate the world as a multiracial person, even with that identity where people are trying to almost, is it like putting yourself in a box almost, right?
100%. Yeah, and it definitely feels that's all in me. The color of my skin is what confuses you, especially when it comes up in a conversation where you're first meeting somebody, which happens sadly quite often.
I think that just speaks to the nature of our biases, right? As human beings, we like our brains, we tend to categorize information in different boxes and labels. And even just what you shared of like people wanting to determine right away, what's your race, your ethnicity, like where are you from? And that already starts that putting people in box kind of a process, right? And I love what you shared about what you do through science as well, because even your work in infectious disease and other important areas that you're working on requires us to move beyond what we think we know in those labels and start to embrace that curiosity. And so I'm feeling so honored that you are part of this conversation with me on this podcast, because I would love to learn more about your approach on how do we embrace our inner scientist, I think you'd called it, right? And actually invite that curiosity as opposed to this natural predisposition to put people in boxes.
Yeah, and I do completely agree to try and categorize things and make sense of things based on what we already know. And that's part of being a scientist, right? I think a lot of times we miss that objectivity and that broader view of there's so much more that matters and other variables that we need to pull in, especially with our relationships and ourselves. I think for me, the curiosity really kicked in on a more emotional level when leading up to the pandemic, still in the before times, my body started to really show me that it was under stress and I was on the verge of burnout. And I just, especially in male dominated fields or maybe my personality and just feeling like I need to prove myself, you build up this armor over time and don't realize it. And while you're trying to keep yourself safe, you're also keeping things out. And I think I didn't even realize like how disconnected I was from my own body and my own emotions. And so for me, I tried therapy. I tried a few different options and trying to find something that would work because I knew I needed help, but I didn't know where or how or what to look for. And over the pandemic, I ended up, there's no travel or anything like that. And I found this person that I listened to on a podcast, Heather Chauvin, and she had an online course on parenting and personal development. And at the time, I had a tween and a teen who were in the middle of a pandemic. And my motivation was really to be better for them. Because what I was doing wasn't working. And so it was there that I learned about how to get curious about myself, my relationships, my work. And as I started to get curious about myself, I started to see the world differently. You start to move out of, as you peel away some of that armor, you start to really see things differently. And that changed everything. Yeah, I think the curiosity part really starts with ourselves. And that's how our curiosity with the world changes, because we don't feel like anybody who disagrees with us or has a differing opinion or is a bit foreign to what we know, it no longer feels like a threat. And so we can ask questions to learn rather than judging that they're different or might be a threat to us.
Absolutely. And I love the way that you described and characterized that because, like totally starts with us, right? It's this ability to like almost hold up a mirror and go, I have some work. Let me get curious about why that is or what it is that needs to shift. And then that kind of builds on our skill set to then hold that space, same space for others or for other views or perspectives that may be foreign to us. And so even that piece, Tara, I'm curious now, speaking of curiosity, what was the moment where you realized that you needed to get curious about yourself? Do you think that there needed to be an event or something that pushed you to get to that precipice of becoming curious, or was it just a natural progression for you?
I think it was definitely a harsh corner to turn, but I think it probably was a more gradual buildup, but I didn't see it. So it wasn't until I began getting like physically ill and mentally couldn't do anything that I was like, something's got to change. And even then, I was reaching out for help. I went to my doctor, I went to the family supports through work, through a therapist, and things like that. And I kept getting the response, oh, you're getting older. Like maybe you just need to eat better and exercise more. Or from the therapist saying, oh, and how does that make you feel? Maybe you should talk to your boss. And I'm like, no, like you're not listening to me. It's just that feeling I had. But I was like, I don't know how to ask a better question or explain this better. And I don't know. It was my first time talking to a therapist. And so when they asked me, how does that make you feel? I think, oh, I expected this and it's not helping. But I think just that curiosity to keep digging, finding alternatives, and just learning about other health modalities that are out there that I really didn't have any exposure to, I didn't know anything about, and being a little bit curious and saying, okay, maybe I'll try this was huge in terms of just being able to peel that armor away just a little bit to be vulnerable enough to say, let me just try something different.
Yeah, and that willingness to experiment, like you said, right? That's such a big part of this. And sometimes I can see situations where, even in my own life, that armor that you refer to, I love that you use the word armor because it is that, right? There's this kind of hardening or like a wall that you build around yourself to avoid certain situations that have caused you pain in the past. And sometimes it's hard to just even say, I'm going to experiment because the questions of what if it doesn't go the way I need it to? What if it's another quote unquote failure for it and I've just wasted a bunch of time, money, whatever? Is there a way to move past that, do you think?
I do. I really do. And I think especially when it comes to emotions and things that make us feel vulnerable or things that maybe don't seem so clear cut is really hard, especially for people in STEM, where I'll say I won't speak for anybody else, but I know moving towards things like math and science, where there's theories, there's experiments, there's testing, but you get clear answers or clear results. And there's is some open to interpretation, but you experiment more to try and understand things. And I think, especially in the STEM fields, there's almost this misunderstanding that emotions are the opposite of rational thinking. That's so far from the truth. Taking emotional awareness and regulation is how we get our brains to a point where we can get back to that executive functioning again. Like we can't live in stress, in survival mode,
and try and think clearly. It doesn't work that way. And so I think just being open to letting different theories or different models of how we can function, which we may not have understood before, when we can open ourselves up to that, maybe you can get to that, maybe I'll try this, or maybe I'll just do this experiment and see if it works.
Oh, so beautifully said. Yeah, it just goes back to that emotional regulation piece, right? And moving away from that fight, flight, freeze response to the executive functioning, like you said, allows us to take back some control over our own mindset and maybe even being open to how can I better experiment or try different things. As you were sharing that, I'm an engineer and I reflect back to some of my own training and education in engineering was like a very like linear style of thinking where you have a hypothesis and you are trained to spot the problem, the risks, and you put in a risk mitigation or you find solutions. Then when it comes down to it mathematically, there's typically right or wrong. You're not really used to all these different shades of gray that may come with human interaction. You think about if someone was to, this is a bad example perhaps, but if someone were to jump off a bridge, it doesn't matter what the color of their skin is, the force of gravity, which is 9.81 meters per second square, is going to affect me the exact same way it's going to affect someone else. So it's like when you move into the social, emotional realm, it's almost confusing where it's how come there are different perceptions and challenges that are associated with something as so random and out of my control, like race. Yeah, I totally hear you with that STEM mindset, or even like with I'll speak for myself with the engineering mindset. When you're trained to think in that logical way and linear way of problem solving, it doesn't leave that much openness for curiosity on these other kind of like gray areas.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And it still sounds like you've been able to take some of the positive approaches of the curious scientific mindset and start to put that towards your work. So I wanted to ask you, how do you think, if we were to go use that term of embracing our inner scientist versus the inner judge, do you think the roles differ, being a scientist versus a judge? And is there a need, or are there situations where one role is more appropriate than the other?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I do think fight or flight system, as you mentioned, our sympathetic, parasympathetic systems, they are part of us for a reason. And sometimes that judge, that inner judge, is going to keep us safe, is going to help us with our boundaries, things like that. So I do think there's definitely a place for that inner judge. I think maybe where the inner scientist and being curious really comes into play is when we're trying to be collaborative, when we want to look past ourselves and be more innovative, when we want to try and understand other points of view. I have an example where there's a certain politician just south of us who may have just voted in, and whatever your opinions are of him, I have mine. And I have a friend of mine that I met through one of my daughter's teams. And we were talking one day and she said, I love Trump. And my first thoughts were, you seem so nice and smart. I don't understand this, right? But when I got to talking to her, and she didn't say it in any mean way, I had no reason to feel threatened. It's not even my country. It was easier for me to say, wow, tell me more. How come you like him? I'm really interested to hear. And from her perspective, she grew up in the States. She grew up in the United States. And she's from a state where there were a lot of problems with drug cartel and things like that. And she had a sibling that was actually killed. And from her personal perspective, the issues that he's talking about that we only see clips of in the media, and like I said, I'm not an American citizen. I don't live there. But hearing her perspective on why his hard stance on things that seemed inhumane to a lot of people were, justice for a family member. And when we talk about things that can be really inflammatory through the pandemic, things like vaccines and stuff like that, people are doing the best that they can. People are making decisions based on personal circumstances that we may not understand. So even though the outcome might be something that we disagree with, your actions
how you vote, whatever, we've lost the ability to have these conversations. We're living in a world of algorithms where we don't see objective news or news that talks about both sides of things anymore. So I think it's now even more important than ever to be able to have these conversations because everybody thinks that they're getting the objective news and that they're right. But there's so many facets or variables to think of when we're talking about things that seem very polarizing. And as wrong as we might think they are, and we may still disagree at the end of a conversation, having understood where someone else is coming from is a really big deal. And I think we need more of that.
Thank you so much for sharing that story too, because that really puts into perspective why your friend would have felt that way. And I think even when I do this work of storytelling, it is about building that empathy and understanding how someone else's lived experiences may have shaped their actions and decisions. And it's not that you have to agree with it or even excuse it if an action created harm. Absolutely, there has to be repercussions for that. But I think just even being able to understand where someone's coming from is so crucial because you're right. The algorithms of today and the way that we're set up to almost be so polarized towards each other and keep ourselves in our own echo chambers is not doing us any favors in terms of expanding our curiosity about what those other factors and variables might even be. And so I love that perspective, Tarah. And I would love to hear more about how you actually start to bring like tangible tools or tips and strategies that you use in your workshops and at your company to invite that curiosity in.
Yeah. So I think a lot of the things that I try and do, I try to keep things very practical. But yeah, I think one of the things that is important is just, like I said, opening up with that curiosity, setting a stage for a safe place to talk. And sometimes that requires one-on-one conversations first. And I like being a consultant in this sense because when a team is having issues or maybe not getting along or maybe not hitting those productivity points that they're trying to reach, having someone outside come in and just ask their opinions because it typically seems like they've tried to communicate their side and it's not getting through or it's not being received. So being an outside person coming in is sometimes a really big help because it's just a fresh perspective, fresh set of ears to hear what they're trying to say. I think too that setting that stage for curiosity, and I think I really love the work that you do with the storytelling. And one of the things I really like to start with too is just expanding the criteria for our diversity and our uniqueness. And just it's beyond ethnicity, nationality, gender, the obvious ones that we can typically see with our eyes, and talking about things that we like, music, food, things like that. What are your hobbies? And just finding some of those places where we have common ground and we can see each other as similar in some aspects, I think really helps to open the conversations for the other things where we might have very differing opinions. But maybe now that we seem a little bit more similar, how can we look at these differing point of views and see the value in each of them? And maybe one gets chosen over the other. Maybe there's a compromise, or maybe there's just a plan laid out in terms of like, how are we going to measure which one is the better option?
Those are all really practical, grounded strategies, right? Creating a safe space, inviting a cold eyes kind of fresh perspective on some of the communication struggles that people are having, which is another avenue for them to feel heard and actually share their voices if they felt that those voices were being heard in the first place, right? And just creating that safe space. And also I love that you touched on the common humanity piece, because that's absolutely the work of storytelling. And what I try to bring forward through these methods also is, can we find that shared humanity? And whether it's through our values or organizational mission, it's also about expanding beyond just the typical markers of diversity, right? And at the same time, bringing together what is our shared purpose. And I think that really gets to the heart of belonging too, because everyone wants to feel like they're part of something bigger and that what they do matters and that they're valued at the end of the day, especially within a team setting or an organization. And so I think we all share that common goal, but our approaches for finding belonging can be so different. And as long as we can all see that at the end of the day, as human beings, we all want that. we all want to feel like we belong. And so I think from that place of groundedness and common humanity, you can start to build on other aspects, right? And yeah, I would love to hear too, Tarah, if you have any advice for someone, let's say they are on a team right now. You don't get to choose your team members, right? And they're not really feeling like they get along. How can they still remain curious and embrace that inner scientist, like you say, and try and create a positive environment for themselves and for others?
Yeah, good question. I think one of the biggest things I found helpful is having a brainstorming session, just setting the stage for, okay, let's take a step back, let's explore all the options, and just draw and write them out. A whiteboard session. And then going back to what the goals are of, maybe for me, it's commonly, what are the goals of the project? What are we trying to achieve? And then that kind of sometimes brings that fresh perspective to things that people have been trying to push, maybe one option, right? So we have the different options laid out. And one phrase that I've actually learned that is really helpful for calming myself down, especially when I might really disagree with somebody, is just to say, tell me more what you mean about X. Like, just that invitation to tell me more changes it from what I might feel like. Why did you say that? What did you mean by that? How can you say that? Those kinds of
The
questions.
judging versus
Sound very judgy, exactly. But to
Yeah.
say, can you tell me more about what you're thinking? Or can you tell me more about this idea you brought up? Because then it turns into, I want to understand what you're saying.
exactly.
Yeah, I found that one really useful. Yeah, tell me more.
I love that. That is just such a tweetable soundbite, for someone to just spark that curiosity for themselves. Because you're right, it moves us from the judging frame to staying open to understanding why, right? And I also like it more than tell me why feels a bit more accusatory almost. Why do you think that?
Yeah, totally.
So appreciate the work that you do. And I think the invitation for others to find out more about your work. And I would myself love to be able to attend one of your workshops in the future because it's an absolutely important topic. And so with that, Tarah, I have a couple more questions for you. First, if you would like to share sort of how people can reach you.
Sure. I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me there. Also, I have a website, diversitysci.com. And so if you click on the, I think, connect with me or something like that button, I can't remember what's on there now, but yeah, it goes right to my email. So we can connect by email. It'd be great to have a conversation. And yeah, I think I'm just starting out with this work. So I'm definitely offering things at a reduced rate to try and build up some work with different areas. My area is scientific, government, university work. And so I'd really love to get more experience working with people in corporations or more of the tech industry because, yeah, I think there's just different things. And my friends that are in oil and gas, that type of thing, the language people use is different, which I find fascinating. And I'd be really curious to know how my language that I use lands with people that are typically using different terminology. Even though we're all speaking the same language, there's definitely different terminology and things mean different things in different contexts.
We'll make sure to link all of that. But you're right. The language and the terminology sometimes is different, even though we're trying to get to the same thing. But I think what you're sharing is really, if we can't move past our differences, then we're not going to be able to leverage the benefits of diversity, of being able to create and innovate and actually find a sense of belonging and unity as well. And I'm so grateful that you're doing this work, Tarah. And I would love to also invite you to share. This is something I ask all my guests. If you could share your thoughts around this question of, I feel a sense of belonging when.
I feel a sense of belonging when I'm understood and appreciated.
I feel understood and appreciated. I love that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of power in people just saying thank you.
And isn't that something that is so underestimated? I see this all the time come up in my work, and I'm not sure why. Maybe there's a sense of vulnerability around it as well. And it's not often until someone has no longer the ability to still interact with someone or loses that opportunity, they go, oh,
I miss that about this person. And can you imagine if we could just have taken that moment to express our gratitude in the moment when they were still around, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that sometimes I think that sometimes it's genuinely that people think that a thank you isn't enough, that they are planning something bigger or want to make sure, or maybe it just gets overlooked. But I think just a simple thank you just makes everybody feel so good, and just that they're noticed and they're appreciated.
100%. And thank you.
Thank you so much for this. It was fantastic and just so lovely to talk to you. And I love the work that you do as well.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Heart to Heart. I'm your host, Gayathri Shukla, founder of Campfire Kinship. If you'd like to learn more about storytelling, come visit campfirekinship.com. If you liked today's episode, hit the subscribe button and join us for future episodes. This podcast is being produced in partnership with CJSW 90.9 in Treaty 7 land in Calgary.